My question tonight is this: does belief in God make sense? Or is it simply a kind of delusion, a sad example of wish-fulfilment on the part of lonely and longing human beings? C.S. Lewis once commented, as he reflected on his early beliefs as an atheist, that nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. So there are important issues to be discussed this evening, and I hope to be able to at least begin to explore some of these with you. The issue has obviously gained prominence recently on account of present debates in our culture, for example, through the new atheism, which began to erupt on our scene in 2006. And while I think its novelty value is receding, these are still, I think, important questions that need to be addressed. Is belief in God a rational response to reality, or is it some kind of outmoded delusion, spread through the population by viruses of the mind, based on flimsy and naive reasoning, and imposed by authoritarian institutions and individuals? Now, there is, of course, a much more radical viewpoint, which is that all human attempts, whether theist or atheist, to construct meaning or establish values are equally delusional. And we find this bleak view set out in a number of writings, and I would certainly include some of Dawkins' writings in this category. For example, he writes, "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is a bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." And the point here is that we impose meaning and value on what is essentially a meaningless universe. Meaning is something then we invent, not something we discern. And clearly that's a very austere thought. And indeed in my own younger days as an atheist, I would have regarded its austerity as a guide to its veracity. If it's so grim, why would anybody believe it unless it was right? But in this lecture, what I want to do is to begin to consider the capacity of the Christian faith to make sense of things. And in choosing to focus on the question of its rationality, I hope it's clear I'm not reducing Christianity to a rational explanation of things, nor am I implying this is the main one of its virtues. I'm simply making the point that our present cultural context has been shaped to some extent by the rise of aggressive assertions that religious faith in general is irrational. And therefore it's necessary, I think, to mount some sort of response to this kind of concern. So in what way does belief in God help us to make sense of things? Making sense of things really matters to us. If we look around the shelves of our bookshops, we see they are cluttered with the latest novels by crime writers like Ian Rankin, Patricia Cornwell, as well, of course, as the greats from the past like Arthur Conan Doyle, Agatha Christie, and Dorothy L. Sayers. These writers built their reputations on being able to hold their readers' attention as countless mysterious murder cases were solved before their eyes. So why do we like this stuff so much? Why is the detective novel such a significant literary genre? Dorothy L. Sayers, who created Lord Peter Wimsey, herself offered an explanation for this. She was invited to give a lecture to the French nation in early 1940. The idea behind this lecture was to bolster French morale in the early stages of the Second World War. And Dorothy L. Sayers thought she would do this by broadcasting on the BBC a lecture in French extolling the virtues of French detective literature. And obviously this was going to be a massive boost to French morale in a very difficult situation. Sadly, Sayers told a friend of hers that she hadn't quite finished preparing her morale-boosting talk on the 4th of June 1940. And obviously the German High Command got wind of this, and they invaded France the next week before the lecture could be given. And the result, I have to tell you, is that Sayers' lecture extolling the virtues of the French detective novel was never broadcast. And I suppose it might make us wonder, would the course of world history have been different if it had been broadcast? I rather doubt it, I have to say. But the lecture does remain worth reading in its own right, because one of our central themes in this lecture is that detective fiction appeals to our deep yearning to be able to discover patterns, to uncover secrets, to discern order on what seems to be an unrelated series of events. We identify clues and we put them together to give us the big picture that makes sense of an otherwise puzzling series of events. To use Sayers' phrase, we follow step by step Ariadne's thread and finally arrive at the center of the labyrinth. And Sayers' argument here is that detective fiction succeeds precisely because we as human beings want to make sense of things. We see ambiguity, we see puzzlement, and we want to be able to see the bigger picture, which, once we know it, enables its various components to belong together. So for Sayers, detective fiction points to this deeper instinct within us, that beneath the patterns we see in the world, there is something deeper that may be discerned. And clearly, this is something that's very significant for the natural sciences. In a very important recent book, Peter Deer, the book's entitled The Intelligibility of Nature, makes the point that the hallmark of the natural sciences is its stress on intelligibility. I quote, "It takes natural phenomena and tries to account for them in ways that not only hold together logically, but also that rest on ideas and assumptions that seem right to us." And it seems to me that the question being asked here, whether by detective fiction or by the natural sciences, is what greater picture unifies our disparate observations? In other words, how can the threads be woven into a single tapestry? How can the clues be resolved in a single picture of what is actually going on? And this, of course, is a vision that captivates the imaginations of many people, and still, I must say, captivates mine. The ability of a theory, whether it's a detective's attempt to make sense of the evidence or the more general human attempt to make sense of the world, to account for what we observe, is rightly and widely seen as an indicator, though not a proof, of its reliability. Now, of course, I will want to begin to explore with you the Christian faith, and I begin by noting recent criticisms of its intrinsic rationality. And in one of the wonderful unsubstantiated assertions that make up so much of his case against religion, Christopher Hitchens tells us that since the invention of the telescope and microscope, religion, I quote, no longer offers an explanation of anything important. It's a nice soundbite, which when placed together alongside many other equally unsubstantiated soundbites, almost manages to create the semblance of an evidence-based argument. But is it anything more than that? In his brilliantly argued recent critique of the new atheism, Terry Eagleton, who's professor of cultural studies at Manchester, ridicules those who treat religion as a purely explanatory entity. He writes, "Christianity was never meant to be an explanation of anything. It's rather like saying that thanks to the electric toaster, we can forget about Chekhov." Or again, he goes on, believing that religion is a botched attempt to explain the world is on the same intellectual level, again I quote, as seeing ballet as a botched attempt to run for a bus. Now, Eagleton, I think, makes an important point here. There is far more to Christianity than simply an attempt to make sense of things. The New Testament is primarily concerned with the transformation of human existence through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And the gospel is thus primarily about salvation, about the transformation of the human situation, rather than explanation. Yet while the emphasis of the Christian faith may not be about explaining the world, there is no doubt that as part of its overall vision, it talks about the transformation of the way in which we see things. At least in principle, it offers us an intellectual matrix, a way of seeing things, a lens that brings things into focus, which allows us to see things in different ways, and thus leads us to act in ways that are consistent with this. Christianity involves believing that certain things are true, that they may be relied upon, and that they illuminate our perceptions, decisions, and actions. So I need to just emphasize that Christian faith is about far more than simply explanation. Faith is relational, it's existential. It engages our emotions and our imagination, going far beyond a capacity to offer intellectual accommodation to our observation of the world. Yet, there is no doubt that one of the core elements of faith, not its totality, but an element, is its ability to position our observations of the world. It offers us a map, a way of seeing reality. Christian faith makes sense in itself and makes sense of what we observe. We could thus think of Christianity as an illuminating radiance that lights up the landscape of reality, allowing us to see things as they really are. And this is a point famously made by C.S. Lewis, who once wrote, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." Again, the French philosopher and social activist Simone Weil, who discovered the Christian faith relatively late in her short life, made this point in this way. If I light an electric torch at night out of doors, I don't judge its power by looking at the bulb, but by seeing how many objects it lights up. The value of a spiritual way of life is appreciated by the amount of illumination it throws on the things of this world. So the point I want to emphasize here is that the ability to make sense of things, the ability to illuminate the map of reality, is an important measure of the reliability of a theory. This, of course, is central to the scientific endeavor. And certainly as a scientist myself in the past, I would often read the writings of Michael Polanyi, the Hungarian chemist who later went on to explore the philosophical implications of the scientific method. And he once wrote, "The pursuit of discovery is guided by sensing the presence of a hidden reality towards which our clues are pointing." It's a nice phrase. A hidden reality towards which our clues are pointing. And clearly you could illustrate this very easily from the history of science. For example, you might think of Isaac Newton's discovery of gravity, the hidden reality which lay behind the falling of an apple from a tree, but also the orbiting of the planets around the sun. And Newton was convinced that this idea of gravity, this invisible force whose existence could not be proved, was the key to unifying the various observations he had before him. And although he was ridiculed for his belief in gravity during his lifetime, he held on to it. This was the way of making sense of what he observed. Towards the end of his life, Newton wrote these words, which I think are a very good statement about the human situation, this inquisitiveness, this longing to make sense of things. He wrote, "I seem to have been only like a small boy playing on the seashore, diverting myself in now and then finding a smoother pebble or prettier shell than the ordinary, while the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." So science, I think, can reasonably be seen as a quest for, in Polanyi's phrase, a hidden reality towards which our clues are pointing. And that word clue is, I think, very significant. There are those who demand absolute proof for everything we believe. But in the real world, it's not like that. When it comes to questions of value or meaning, we are weaving together clues and trying to work out what is the best way of making sense of these. For example, C.S. Lewis famously observed that the human sense of right and wrong could be seen as, I quote, clues to the meaning of the universe. And clearly these clues are not hard proofs, they are soft pointers, but they are woven together to yield a way of looking at things and making sense of them. Now today, as we were reminded earlier, we are on the brink of marking the 150th anniversary of the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species. I think therefore it's important to pay homage to Darwin and also to note the importance of that work for our topic this evening. Because Darwin's Origin of Species, as those of you who have read it will know, is basically a series of extended reflections on a series of puzzling observations. And Darwin's quest was to find the best explanation for what he observed. For example, the persistence of rudimentary structures, the phenomenon of extinction, and the uneven geographical distribution of biological species. And for Darwin, the hidden reality, to use Polanyi's phrase, towards which these clues were pointing was what he later called natural selection. And Darwin was absolutely clear. This was something towards which these clues pointed, but it was not something that could be proved. And for Darwin, he found himself in the position that he personally was convinced that his theory was right, but he knew not simply that he could not prove it, but more than that, that it could not be proved. And in the end, Darwin said, I take my stand on the capacity of this theory to make sense of things. I cannot prove it, but I may rely upon its capacity to make sense of what is observed. He writes, it can hardly be supposed that a false theory would explain in so satisfactory a manner as does the theory of natural selection the several large classes of facts above specified. It has recently been objected that it is an unsafe method of arguing. Darwin here is referring to those who say you must prove things before you believe them. Unevidenced beliefs are unacceptable. But Darwin makes this point. This is a method used in judging the common events of life and has often been used by the greatest moral philosophers. And the point that Darwin is making is that when it comes to many things, we are not going to be able to prove them. We are going to be confronted with two major questions. Number one, why should I take this seriously? What are the intellectual foundations of a way of looking at things? And then secondly, what way of looking at things does this make possible? And does this make more sense of what is observed than rival theories? Now, we see both these concerns in Darwin, and of course, for us today, they remain important. When it comes to assessing the rationality of a belief, we can really begin to look at two quite different issues. Number one, what is the evidence for believing that this theory is true? And number two, how good is this theory at accommodating what is actually observed in the world? Now, clearly there are many writers who have looked at the first of these. What arguments and evidence might be used to lead us to develop the idea that there is a God? And the question of the evidences or the argumentations that might be used to come to this conclusion have been explored by others such as William Lane Craig, Richard Swinburne, and if I dare mention them, C.S. Lewis. And these offer very comprehensive explorations of that theme. And rather than simply repeat what they have said, I thought this evening I would explore the second aspect of this question. Namely, what is the capacity of belief in God to actually make sense of what we see around us in the world? What is the, if I could use this phrase, empirical fit between the theory and observation? How good is the match between what we see and what we believe? Now, those of you who study philosophy of science will be perfectly aware of the importance of this issue. N.R. Hansen and many others have made the point that actually we view the world through what they call theory-laden spectacles. In other words, we all see things through a framework that is already shaped by a theory. Maybe not something we've consciously articulated, but nevertheless something that is there. And in part, the scientific enterprise is about working out what specific set of theoretical spectacles bring the world into sharpest and clearest focus. And that sometimes means we discard one set of spectacles and pick up another. And so the question really is, what set of spectacles, what theoretical framework brings nature into the sharpest focus? So in this lecture tonight, I'm going to look briefly, I fear, at three areas of human experience. And I'm going to reflect on how the Christian faith casts light on them. I'm going to be asking the question, how effective is the Christian way of seeing things at making sense of what we observe? I'm going to begin by looking at a very broad topic, one I think that's enormously important, and that is how we begin to make sense of human history and human culture. It's a major question at this time, and one clearly that needs to be made sense of. A number of controlling narratives have been proposed to make sense of cultural development, the way in which human history has proceeded. One of them, which seems to be favored by some new atheist writers, is that of the progressive improvement of the human condition through the erosion of what they would see as religious superstition and the emancipation of humanity from all taboos and arbitrary limits. It has, I think, become more difficult to sustain this meta-narrative in the West recently, as the manifest failings of Western liberalism have become increasingly clear. Indeed, if I revert to Terry Eagleton's recent critique of the new atheism, this seems to be one of the areas he himself regards as being most significant. Eagleton describes what he calls the dream of untrammeled human progress as, I quote, a bright-eyed superstition, a fairy tale which lacks any rigorous evidential base. He writes, if ever there was a pious myth and a piece of credulous superstition, it is the liberal rationalist belief that a few hiccups apart, we are all steadily en route to a better world. And those of you who've read Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, will note with interest, I think, that the final chapter, which concludes this polemic against religion, is a plea for a return to the Enlightenment, especially the form it took in the 18th century. And here I think we see what is really the myth of a lost golden age. And I think really we do need to call this into question. The new atheism often accuses those who believe in God of holding on to what they call unevidenced beliefs, in contrast to the rigorously proven factual statements of enlightened atheists. Yet what of its own belief in human progress? Eagleton argues that this, he calls it a myth, is a demonstrably false pastiche, a luminous example of what he calls blind faith. What rational soul, he asks, could sign up to such a secular myth, which is obliged to treat such human-created catastrophes as Hiroshima, Auschwitz, and apartheid as, quote, a few local hiccups, which in no way discredit or disrupt the steady upward progress of history. The difference between Christianity and the New Atheism, it seems to me, is their choice of so-called unevidenced beliefs. Neither can be proved, but this does not prevent us from making an adjudication as to which appears to be the more reliable. And so I must then move on and begin to talk about the Christian reading of culture and history. What I would like to do is to note very briefly some points that seem to me to be of importance. There are two controlling themes that undergird and inform any Christian attempt to make sense of history on the one hand and culture on the other. First, that humanity bears the image of God, and secondly, that humanity is sinful. And while theologians and religious communities may differ in the relative emphasis they place upon these two elements, they are nonetheless the twin poles around which any attempt to make sense of the enigmas and puzzles of human existence are orbiting. On the one hand, we find ourselves excited and inspired by the vision of God, which draws us upwards. Yet on the other, we find ourselves pulled down by the frailty and fallenness of human nature. It's a familiar dilemma. We long to do good, but we seem to end up doing something that is evil. And many of us would go to the famous articulation of this in Paul's letter to the Romans. I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. From a Christian perspective, it's clear that we must recognize at one and the same time a greater destiny or a greater capacity in human nature than most political philosophers allow, while at the same time a corresponding capacity to fail to achieve such aspirations. This way of thinking, this bipolar attempt to make sense of things, allows us to frame the complex picture we see of human culture and history, characterized by aspirations to greatness and goodness on the one hand, and oppression and violence on the other. And many have commented on the profound ambiguity of history and the havoc which it wreaks on naive theories of the goodness of human nature. Terry Eagleton is one of a series of commentators to point out the darker side of contemporary human culture. He points to, I quote, corporate greed, the police state, a politically compromised science, and a permanent war economy. Or history on the other. Again, Eagleton points to the misery wreaked by racism and sexism, the sordid history of colonialism and imperialism, and a generation of poverty and famine. As a species, humanity may indeed have the capacity to do good, but this seems matched by a capacity for evil. I know there are many who would say they believe profoundly in the goodness of human nature, and I respect that viewpoint. But it seems to me to be very difficult to sustain that in the light of the empirical evidence. Yes, we are capable of goodness, but yes, I fear also we are capable of great evil. The question is how we recognize and address this issue. A recognition of this ambiguity seems to me to be essential if we are to avoid political and social utopianism based on naive, ideologically driven, non-empirical value judgments about human nature. Let me quote to you from J.R.R. Tolkien, writing in the year 1931 and beginning to lay out some themes that would occur in his Lord of the Rings. When realizing that Europe was going through a politically traumatized period, he began to despair about political utopianism, which failed to engage the harsh reality of human nature. And he wrote these words: I will not walk with your progressive apes, erect and sapient. Before them gapes the dark abyss to which their progress tends. And Tolkien there was making the point that a naive view of humanity leads to political utopianism in which progress leads to catastrophe. So it seems to me there is something to be said here for this realistic account of ourselves and our capacities. But let me move on, if I might now, to look at another area which always seems to me to be enormously important, where we look not so much at the world or history, but look inside ourselves. Because I want to begin to engage the dynamics of inner human subjectivity. In other words, the feelings and emotions which lie at the heart of so many of our concerns and which so excited the Romantic poets and writers. What, if anything, might the Christian faith have to say about these? How can its theoretical lens engage these experiences? The Christian tradition has engaged this question from its outset. And I give you many examples, but time, I think, forced me only to note some. In his book, The Confessions, Augustine of Hippo, writing around the year 400, related how his reading of Platonists led him to explore his own inwardness, and there encountered, in his own words, an immutable light higher than my mind. And really, Augustine was saying that as he looked inwards, he began to discern traces of something that was drawing him upward, traces of something transcendent, which nonetheless impacted on him right there and then. And certainly, this has been developed by many writers, but I think C.S. Lewis, in the 20th century, articulates these with great clarity, and therefore I will use him in dialogue with. Lewis acknowledges the importance of frustrated aspirations for many of us. I quote, "There was something we grasped at in the first moment of longing, which just fades away in the reality." And Lewis there is pointing to this moment of insight where we realize there is something significant, yet something that seems to fade away as we reach out to try and grab it and take hold of it. How is that to be interpreted? Lewis himself both describes this feeling in depth and also tries to make sense of it. He notes two possibilities that he regards as simply flawed. First, to assume that this frustration for reality, for something that matters, simply arises because we are looking in the wrong places. Or, secondly, to conclude that further searching will only result in repeated disappointment, so that any attempt to find something that is better than this world and its possibilities is simply a mistake. There is, Lewis argues, a third way, which is to recognize that these earthly longings or yearnings are, quote, only a kind of copy or echo or mirage of our true homeland. And Lewis then goes on to develop what we might loosely call an argument from desire, which basically runs like this. Every natural desire has a corresponding object and is satisfied only when this is attained or experienced. I am hungry, I need food. I am thirsty, I find water. Secondly, he argues that there is also a natural desire for transcendent fulfillment, which cannot be attained or experienced by or through anything in the present world. We yearn, but we find no satisfaction, no lasting satisfaction in this world. And therefore, he argues, thirdly, that this natural desire for transcendent fulfillment can only be fulfilled beyond this world, which points beyond it to our true destiny. In other words, that our yearnings and aspirations and longings are genuine. They correspond to something, but is not something that is given in or satisfied by anything that is finite or created. Now, that isn't really an argument at all. It needs much further unpacking. In many ways, it's an attempt to link together clues, to weave together threads into a fabric and ask what pattern is disclosed. But Lewis saw this line of thought, if I can use that more neutral way of speaking, as demonstrating the correlation of faith with experience. If you like, to explore the empirical adequacy of the Christian way of seeing reality with what we find within us. Lewis clearly believes that the Christian faith casts light on the realities of our subjective experience. And as many of you will know, Augustine of Hippo back in the 5th century wove these ideas together into a prayer which I suspect some of you here tonight will know very well. You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Lewis affirms that notion and tries to ground it in the world of human experience. Now, clearly, there's much more I need to explore in this respect, but I haven't got time to do so. And I want to move on and look at the third and final area of this engagement with the world, which is the natural sciences. How do the natural sciences fit in the geography of faith? When I was much younger, I took the view that the natural sciences inexorably propelled you to atheism, that it was so obvious that the natural sciences had eroded the conceptual space in which God might once to have been thought to live, that that was the end of the matter. I have to say that my own thinking on this matter was changed not so much by reading about theology, but by reading about the history and philosophy of science, which made me realize that actually the history of science was not about the proving of this, that, and the other, but rather the gradual realization that this made more sense of things than anything else, but that perspective might change over time. And that helped me to see, I think, that you could believe that certain things were true without being absolutely able to prove it. It's a very important point. And my own time as a research science in Oxford impressed upon me the privilege of being able to investigate a universe that is both rationally transparent and rationally beautiful, capable of being represented in elegant mathematical forms. And one of the most significant parallels between the natural sciences and Christian theology is a fundamental conviction that the world is characterized by regularity and intelligibility. And if I had to single out a writer who explores this with great clarity, I think I would look towards John Polkinghorne, the Cambridge theoretical physicist who late in his career decided to begin studying Christian theology. And Polkinghorne argues in a series of writings that there is what he calls a congruence between our minds and the universe, between what he calls the rationality experienced within and the rationality observed without. And he argues that a naturalistic metaphysics is unable to cast light on the deep intelligibility of the universe, in effect being forced to treat it as a fortunate accident. That is the way things are. That is just something we have to accept. He argues that a theistic metaphysics, a way of looking at things grounded in a rigorous belief in God, argues that there is a common origin to both the rationality we find in our minds and the rational structure of the physical world. And he argues that these both reflect the deeper rationality of God. And his argument is that Christianity offers us a framework which makes sense of what is otherwise simply a happy coincidence on which the natural sciences depend. Others have pointed to the growing interest in what are sometimes called anthropic phenomena. Basically, the idea that in some way the universe seems to be fine-tuned for human existence. Nature's fundamental constants seem to have been fine-tuned to reassuringly life-friendly values. And again, writers such as Sir Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal and President of the Royal Society, has argued that the emergence of human life in the aftermath of the Big Bang is governed by a mere 6 numbers, each of which is so precisely determined that a minuscule variation in any one would have made this universe and life as we know it impossible. Does this prove anything? No. No, we need to be very clear about that. But as I would want to argue, they resonate with a Christian way of looking at things. They fit in with what Christians believe to be true. They prove nothing, and certainly other explanations are possible. It is simply one clue amongst many others. But as I've been emphasizing, the key point is not simply an individual clue, but their accumulation, the way in which they are woven together to disclose a bigger pattern. A Christian reading of the world offers, in my view, a significant degree of empirical fit with what may be observed. What I note with interest is the significant number of natural scientists who want to explore this deeper, more metaphysical side of things. I admire this scientific method enormously. It is, in my view, the most secure form of human knowledge, but it also has its limits. And the real question I think we have to face is, how do we engage with questions that lie beyond the scope of the scientific method? Questions like Karl Popper's ultimate questions. Why are we here? What is the pointing of life? And certainly you'll find many natural scientists who recognize the limitations to the scientific method. For example, the distinguished biologist Francisco Ayala argues that, I quote, "the scientific view of the world is hopelessly incomplete, and that there are matters of value, meaning, and purpose that are outside science's scope." It seems to me that's an extremely important point. Many of you will have read Roy Baumeister's fascinating book, Meanings of Life, in which he argues that to make sense of things, to give us a reason for living, we need to look at questions of value, questions of agency, and questions of purpose. And these are non-empirical notions. You cannot read them off from the natural world. In many ways, the question is, what understanding of purpose do we discern within the world? Do we arrive at by putting these clues together? It lies beyond the scope of the scientific method, but it is an area of human thought that seems to me to be enormously important. But I've spoken for a long time, and I think it's time to begin to bring this lecture to a close. In this lecture, I've been exploring very briefly, I fear very inadequately, the question of the rationality of the Christian faith. And I've decided to focus on the question of how well its core ideas map onto the world of human experience. The point I've been making is that Christianity offers a big picture account of reality, which allows the underlying unity of the world to be appreciated. And many of you will have read William James's reflections on this theme, the very famous Harvard psychologist, and he talked about, I quote, "faith in the existence of an unseen order of some kind in which the riddles of the natural order may be found and explained. And for James, the question really was, what hidden order explains what we do observe? And James was very clear that we would not be able to prove this. There was always going to be a question about the plausibility of any worldview we brought to bear. But James also made the point very clearly in his essay, The Will to Believe, that as a matter of fact, we rely on many insights that we cannot prove to be true, but nonetheless believe to be reliable. They are what James calls working hypotheses, ideas that seem to make sense of things and that we use because they seem to be reliable. Recent works in the philosophy of science have emphasized the importance of unification in scientific explanation. In other words, showing that phenomena which might be thought to be unrelated somehow fit together in a greater scheme of things. Once we discover the underlying unity of nature, we are better able to experience and understand its inner aspects. My argument in this lecture has been that the Christian faith gives us a net, a Kantian net, that we can throw over the essence of human experience. It positions our observations and locates them within a greater scheme of things. The British philosopher and novelist Iris Murdoch once spoke of what she called the calming, whole-making tendencies of human thought. Whole-making, in other words, positioning within a view of the totality of things. It's able to engage the complexities of observation and experience, recognizing that in the end, no theory is able fully to comprehend what we observe, but nonetheless forcing us to ask which seems to give the best account. And the Christian faith, I want to suggest, is a way of thinking which leads easily and naturally to a way of living, hoping, and acting. It's a worldview that is grounded in reason, but not limited by reason. It's a grand narrative which can help us understand and navigate the road of life set out in our own narrative. If I can put it like this, Christian theology is our map and God himself our compass as we journey through the world. I mentioned St. Paul earlier. Let me mention him again. His insight that we walk by faith, not by sight. I hope this short lecture will open up this discussion of how the Christian faith illuminates the world and brings it into sharper focus. For many of us, the question is, how can we bring this world into sharper focus and understand our own identity, agency, and purpose within it? And I hope that these brief reflections on the rationality of the faith will point to its ability to make sense of things, its reasonableness, its capacity to guide us as we journey through life, trying to discern the bigger picture of which we are part. I believe that this faith enables us to journey in hope, but I know it enables us to journey with a deeper grasp of the realities of life. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Well, Professor McGrath has given us a feast already in that lecture this evening, but he has also generously offered you a second course, and that is that he is willing to field some questions that may be come up out of the discussion, We've got maybe half an hour or a little bit less to explore some of the ideas. And then, of course, you are all invited to join us for a reception afterwards upstairs, at which we can continue the conversation. I've got two of our very helpful assistants in the chaplaincy who are here with radio mics. So I would ask you very much if you'd like to indicate a hand or something, they'll bring a microphone to you. And if you can briefly identify your question, then we'll be able to move forward into our discussion. So, who would like to bat first? Stunned into silence.
The neo-Darwinian view of the evolutionary process tends to use a sort of as a phrase that evolution will be random, unplanned, and unguided. So I'd just ask you what your reflection would be on those terms, random, unplanned, and unguided, if that is the basis of life on Earth.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That's a big question, but I think I will just begin to map out what a possible answer might look like. First of all, I want to make a very sharp distinction between Darwinism as a scientific theory, which, like all other scientific theories, is provisional, open to correction as time goes on, and then Darwinism as a worldview. And part of this Darwinian worldview is almost the exclusion by definition of any purpose, meaning, significance. And that is actually a metaphysical judgment which goes rather beyond the scientific facts. And certainly, there are many who would be very, very unhappy about this tendency of Darwinism to be morphed from the scientific theory into this bigger picture of reality. And certainly for some writers, it is now axiomatic that Darwinism excludes what we used to call teleology. But interestingly, I mean, philosophers of biology are fighting back against this. Basically, if you read, for example, Ernst Mayer's recent writings on the philosophy of biology before his recent death at the age of, I think it was 102, so being a biologist can bring some good things, he simply makes the point that, that there is something teleological in the natural world. He objects to anybody imposing a metaphysical teleology from outside, but he says that we can discern something from within. And I think that's an important point. And of course, it's developed much more significantly in a book that you may have read by Simon Conway Morris, who's professor of evolutionary paleobiology at Cambridge. And in his book, Life's Solution, Morris says, look, evolution may zigzag, but actually the evolutionary landscape is to some extent predetermined. In other words, you may take a while to get there, but there are only certain endpoints. So what I think I would want to do is to say that I fully accept that the evolutionary process seems to be random. Darwin, in his autobiography, says it's a bit like the wind blowing. You're not quite sure which way it's going. But that the fact that we cannot discern directionality, that we can't see a sort of reason behind it, is more likely to be a statement about our inability to discern than what is really there. So I would want to cause some doubts to be raised about Darwinism as a worldview, which excludes any idea of purpose as a matter of almost pre-conviction. I think the evidence is much more open. And I think that the real difficulty is this transitioning from good science to dogmatic metaphysics. And I think that's something we really need to fight. We've got to preserve science's integrity by preventing it from lapsing into some kind of metaphysical dogmatism. But I need to say much more, but Richard's already agitating here. I must move on to our next question.
While Ben is bringing the microphone down to this gentleman here, Douglas, would you like to take that? We'll take that. But let's go one from this side, and then after that we'll come to this side, Ben.
Thank you for your lecture. You talked about a Christian view of natural phenomena and explanation, but isn't it true that it is a theistic view and could be true of other other religions having an explanation for the natural phenomena.
Yes, thank you. Again, it's a very good question, and one that needs a very long answer. But let me try to begin to answer. It's certainly true that Christianity believes in God, and of course many other, but not all other religions also believe in God. And so your question is quite rightly, well, what is distinctive about this? I think that's a very fair point. I think that while it is true that most religions believe in God, not all of them do. I think that's one of the problems for, this equation of belief in God with religion. Actually, they are quite different ideas, even though they map onto each other at certain points. But certainly, what I'd want to say is that while Christians believe in God, they would try to distinguish this vision of God from alternatives. To give you an example, I mean, there is no doubt that Christianity is historically and to some extent intellectually continuous with Judaism. But actually, it moves that in a quite different direction. And certainly, when I was talking a bit about the ambiguities of history, I began to talk about, for example, the sinfulness of human nature. And that actually is a view of humanity which would not be shared, for example, by Islam, which in effect sees human nature as something that is able to discern God's will and then carry it out. Most Christian writers would say, well, actually, we have genuine problems in discerning God's will and even more in carrying them out because there is something wrong with human nature as we now know it. So certainly what I'd want to say is that the idea of believing in God is part of the Christian web of ideas, but that there's more to it than that. And distinctiveness lies partly in its idea of God, but also in the other beliefs that gather around it. For example, an understanding of human nature, or of course, in particular, an understanding of who Jesus is. And thus, for Christians, the idea of the incarnation does play quite a significant role. The idea that God somehow entered into history, that in some way God took human nature upon himself. And again, that gives us a very different understanding of human nature. It also, I think, gives us a different understanding of history. So the short answer to what was a very good question is really that I would certainly agree there are commonalities, but I think there are also quite significant divergences, which are appropriate in thinking of Christianity as offering a distinctive way of looking at things, even though there may be some overlaps with other ways of thinking. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Anybody else on this side we can bring a mic to?
Yes, hello. In the 1890s, physicists were fairly confident that everything was sewn up. There were just two little clouds on the horizon, one to do with the formula for heat radiation, which was wrong, another one that the speed of the Earth around the Sun appeared to be zero, according to measurements, which appeared to be odd. Well, each of those little clouds turned out to presage a complete revolution in physics, the quantum theory and relativity. So I want to suggest that you are very fortunate, Professor McGrath, in living in a period where the two, what I think are two little clouds on the theological horizon, can be pretty well dismissed, but that in the course of the next few years of scientific discoveries about the brain will become more difficult for theology. The first one is human agency, because I would suggest that it depends on the state of the brain at the moment, and religion seems to, or theology demands some magical faculty of free will which can act independent of the state of the brain. Whether such a thing exists is problematic. The second thing is to do with pain, which we can easily say, well, it's there because it's very useful for us, but it might turn out that it's not efficacious. We experience the pain, but the pain itself doesn't do the things we think it does, in which case it would appear to be a rather gratuitous addition. So
well,
those are the two little clouds.
Thank you for, I think it's a very perceptive question, and one that, again, needs a very long answer, but I'll certainly try and engage with you. You begin by making what I think is a very fair point. I mean, we had the ultraviolet catastrophe of and things like that of the 1890s, which really brought classical physics into question. And I think I take the point you've made, it's a good point. I think it also which I think you were hinting at, makes us realize that this may be what scientists feel at the moment, but actually in 10, 20 years' time, we may be in quite different territory. So I think that observation is a very important reminder of the provisionality of contemporary scientific thinking. This may be the way we think at the moment, but it is, at least in principle, always open to correction and may take us in directions that we find very surprising. And I agree with you completely. I think that's a very fair point. And then you move on to talk about a number of questions that arise from neurology, amongst many other things, about our increasing understanding of how the human brain works. And certainly that there's a huge amount of work being done on this, and you're right to highlight it as being very important. And you may have seen books with titles like, suggesting that there is a God spot in the brain and so on. I think we need to be a little bit careful about those, because really, I think those positron emission tomography results are really showing is simply that there is enhanced blood flow in certain parts of the human brain when people think about things that excite them. And certainly, there is no doubt that when nuns think about God, it excites them. When you do the same experiment with people who are very into green politics, the thought of green politics also excites them. So we need to be careful about that. But you're right. I think that there are big questions about where neurology is going to take us in the future. Free will, it's an idea I don't really buy into. I know what you mean, but for me, we are shaped by factors over which we do not have total control. And for me, actually, our physical and mental makeup is part of that. And actually, for me, I quoted that phrase in St. Paul, I end up wanting some things, but ending up doing some things that are completely opposite. Actually is almost a recognition that there seems to be some sort of fallibilism, that we want to do certain things but cannot. And that seems to me to point in some very helpful directions in terms of where things are taking us. Again, you and I must talk in 20 years' time and see where things go. But my personal view, which obviously is a hunch rather than a very well-formed belief, is that actually neurology is raising very big questions for all of us, for religious believers, but also for those who don't believe in God, and especially for those who I think are committed to value systems. Where do these come from? And I think there are going to be some very interesting questions about how we identify and live the good life that are raised by this as well. So I think this might be almost what Daniel Dennett calls a universal acid. That actually these insights may well end up corroding or at least challenging a lot of ideas and forcing some rethinking. And we'll see where that takes us. Thank you.
I'm being very restrained myself tonight, but I can't also help myself from making a brief comment there, which is one of the things I like to do to twist the tail of my atheist friends is always to compliment them on their faith. And I have to say, sir, that after thousands of years of human philosophy dealing with human agency and pain, if you think brain science is going to explain that totally in the next 20 years, I admire your faith. The gentleman over there.
Just to build on the previous topic of discussion, in neuroscience, there's a big focus, or in our current discourse, on consciousness, what constitutes consciousness as. There are some of us who believe that it's just neural networks, it's purely physical, and from that arises everything that makes us human in a sense. But then there are others who believe that there's a kind of immaterial spirit which is separate to the brain, in almost another dimension of existence which is inaccessible to human beings. I think my question is, if we were to, well, in inverted commas, establish as a discourse that there was a spirit, that it was a clue leading towards God, what difference do you think this would make? Why is it important for us to believe that consciousness is composed of this spirit?
Thank you. And you're quite right that the whole field of consciousness studies is expanding hugely. And I mean, some would argue it's an epiphenomenon. Actually, it's simply something layered on top of something that's fundamentally physical. But whatever it is, it's actually very important to us. It's an integral part of being human. And likewise, we talk loosely about mind, But really, what is there is the brain, and mind is actually something slightly different. And I think that you raise a number of questions. One is, where does this come from? And again, that's a very important question. But your question is more focused on what difference does it make? Is it significant? In particular, this idea of spirit. And I think the best thing I can do is simply tell you what I think about this. And you can tell me afterwards if you think I'm right or wrong. I mean, certainly there are a lot of people who would say that human nature is fundamentally polarized between what you might call flesh and spirit, or a material dimension and a spiritual dimension. That there's some kind of spirit within us inhabiting an essentially material body. And I know what's meant by that, but actually it's not really what I think. And I'll tell you what I think. I base myself more on what I read in parts of the Old Testament, which actually say that words like soul and so on actually don't really refer to parts of the human body, but rather to humanity as it exists in certain ways. And therefore, for example, the Hebrew word that we normally translate as soul, nephesh, for me really is about humanity as we relate to God. That the fundamental thing is this capacity to relate, which doesn't mean adding something extra to human nature. It's much more about the transformation of human nature by relationships with significant others, of whom God, of course, is a very important part. And I see that, for example, in Psalm 8. And for me, this has enormous implications. If I give you one example, which goes way beyond your question, but is nevertheless important, what happens to someone who believes strongly in God and then develops something like Alzheimer's or Parkinsonism, and they begin to lose their memory? They begin to forget who they are and who those around them are. I mean, one of the most interesting things you can explore here is you may forget, but you are not forgotten. In other words, that this relationship perseveres, that God remembers us, even though we, through our frailty, have lost that insight. There's a lot more that needs to be said, but it's a great question and a good question, and I've just thrown a few ideas your way. There's a lot more that needs to be said.
Thank you very much. That reminds me very much of the very important book by David Keck, written about his mother's descent into Alzheimer's, described as forgetting whose we are, not just who we are, and that we are God's, and God goes on and remembers us. Another question, please.
Thank you. I'd like to return to the provisionality of knowledge as it relates to science. And there's the kind of Kuhnian notion of the scientific paradigm, which changes from time to time, and new spectacles are required. What I'd like to ask is, what do you think accounts for the persistence of the Christian spectacles?
Well, that's, again, a wonderful question. We've got 5 minutes. Let me try and begin to engage with it, because it's a good one. I think actually others would have wanted to ask a question very similar to that, because it does arise very naturally out of what I've been saying. I mean, first of all, your point about Thomas Kuhn and others. I mean, in many ways, the enigma Kuhn was wrestling with was precisely that you find stated in Michael Polanyi's book, Personal Knowledge, which is that scientists believe that certain things are right, and they know that in the future some of these will be shown to be wrong. The difficulty is they're not sure which ones, and that really is a problem. And those of you scientists, I mean, there is no need to despair about this. I mean, the key point is simply to say, this is the best way of making sense of things today, but we recognize that in time to come, things will move on. But it's the quest that matters. And thus science, for me, is always better seen as a quest, a method, rather than an established body of beliefs. And so when someone says to me, well, science has shown this, I'm always cautious, because that may be where we are pausing at the moment, but it's not a permanent resting place. So your question then invites us to move on and say, why might one think that Christianity, belief in God, is going to be part of the future rather than simply something that is left to one side. For example, I don't believe in phlogiston. I'm sure nobody here does. But actually, if we'd been meeting a couple of hundred years ago, it would have been the hot topic. So there is this question about this. I think that there are several things I could say. One of them is this. One of them is from a theological perspective. One's from a more scientific perspective. From a theological perspective, again, I'm stating my belief that this is right, but of course this is very much open to debate. We are made to relate to God, and unless we do that, we are going to be empty, dissatisfied. The idea that God has placed eternity in our hearts, or that quote I gave you from Augustine as a prayer, "You have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it finds rest in you." If I could put that in very, very plain English, that's saying there's a homing instinct within us. In other words, that we recognize there is a home, we want to find a way back, and actually, that's the way things seem to be. And therefore, I'd want to say that actually that vision of human nature is actually setting out something very important about who we really are and what we're really looking for. So that certainly points in one direction for me. The second point I want to make is this. When I myself was an atheist back in the late 60s, early 70s, that was the height of the secularization thesis. You probably remember this, that there was this pervasive belief that the next generation would not believe in God. It was kind of way outmoded, it was on its way out, and it was driven to some extent by a Marxist ideology, but actually there was a much more general sociological foundation for this. It's certainly true that in Western Europe, at least something of that has come to pass. Elsewhere, it hasn't. In fact, if anything, it's been reversed. I remember having a very interesting conversation with a leading Dutch atheist. We were debating in Amsterdam, and he said to me, in despair, I have to say, that your side, pointing at me, are going to win simply because it's only in Western Europe that atheism has become culturally embodied. And that's very interesting because although in this lecture I've been talking about rationality as if it's my head and your head, actually we all know that plausibility is partly socially constructed. And what I'd want to make is that in Europe we find not simply the articulation, but also to some extent now the enforcement of essentially secular ways of thinking. And that, I think, is quite important. I don't want to single out a single case study, but the removal of crucifixes from Catholic schools in Italy, where actually most people want them there, it is a quite important indicator of the way in which Europe is going. Europe is the exception. And I'm a European, and actually I quite like being European. But actually I do need to be aware that things are very different elsewhere. And it raises this fascinating question. As more and more people migrate from elsewhere in the world to Europe, what is the future religious demographic going to look like? I'm no prophet, but I think it's reasonable to say it's going to be an interesting topic to follow.
Someone also had his hand up, so
we'll
very quick last question.
Quick last question.
Thank you. Actually, is it correct for me to say that you actually draw inspirations from Bible or Christianity rather than take it as a fact? All the things in Bible happened. So if Bible is written by human beings and it's based on human beings' senses, it could be wrong because like Newton's theory of gravity, later Einstein proved it to be wrong because human senses does not necessarily review what is true in the reality. So, so why is it still reasonable to believe in Bible and Christianity?
I think, again, that's a very good question, and this needs a lecture, I hate to say. If I could give you a sketch map of the sort of things I'd want to say. There are many ways of looking at the Christian Bible, and C.S. Lewis gives a very good little sketch. He says these are the records of those who discovered God as a reality in their life, and particularly that they saw something absolutely distinctive about the person and the fate of Jesus of Nazareth, and felt that they wanted to communicate to those following them three things, I think. Number one, what they saw happening. Number two, their interpretation of the significance of this for them and by implication for those who followed them. And then thirdly, a kind of mapping out of the sort of way of life that they believed that this was made appropriate. And certainly there are very interesting questions about how the Bible is to be interpreted, and you're absolutely right to raise those. But I think at its core, it's trying to map out this experience of God, the transformation it makes, and the way of living it makes possible. So that has to be a very brief response to that question, but it's a good one, and it needs a bigger response.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've had a fantastic run around the questions of the rationality of faith this evening. It just remains for me to sum up one or two quick announcements, and then we will be able to go upstairs for our refreshments. But first, I need to say a huge thank you to the Christian Evidence Society, to my colleagues and trustees and so on, for sponsoring tonight's event, enabling us to be able to have it here in this wonderful Franklin Wilkins auditorium, and for the reception upstairs, which we'll be having shortly. I have already mentioned that we are having tonight recorded. It will be available on the CES website, hopefully from some point in the early part of next week. And you can find a large amount of other interesting material on the CES website, christianevidencesociety.org.uk, or just Google Christian Evidence Society, and you'll be able to find that there. Can I also just plug the fact that 2 weeks tonight we shall be following up this celebration in memory of the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of the Species by hosting a new project, a play called Mr. Darwin's Tree, which has been written by the very distinguished playwright Murray Watts. It had a dress rehearsal in a small church just opposite the House of Commons last week, known as Westminster Abbey. But this is really its main London premiere, of course, here at King's College London, in the chapel on the Strand, 2 weeks tonight at 6 p.m. Mr. Darwin's Tree is part of the Theos Public Theology think tank. Upstairs, as we go to the reception, there will also be a bookstall. And I've already mentioned Alister McGrath's new book, and the bookstall is groaning with the weight of some of the very many books that Professor McGrath has written. I won't even start to list them, otherwise we will never get to drinks. So do go and have a look at the bookstall afterwards. There are various members of my team from the Dean's Office and the Chaplaincy who are beginning to position themselves so in order to help you get up the spiral staircase. Apparently it's now a health and safety hazard to allow you to have drinks outside in the foyer, so we make you go up the much bigger health and safety hazard of the staircase to get to the restaurant, which is where the drinks are taking place. We hope you'll be able to join us there, and you'll have the opportunity to say thank you to Professor McGrath personally. But first, can we corporately thank Alister McGrath for a wonderful lecture. Thank you, Alister.